Picture this. You're out in the woods with your work crew on a regular November evening in 1975, finishing up another day of logging in the Arizona mountains. It's been a long day, you're tired, and all you want to do is get back to town and grab a beer. Then suddenly, your buddy gets out of the truck to get a closer look at some strange lights in the forest. And the next thing you know, he's lying unconscious on the ground after being hit by what can only be described as a bolt of energy from a massive UFO hovering right above the trees. That's exactly what happened to Travis Walton and his 6 coworkers on November 5, 1975, in what would become one of the most thoroughly investigated and controversial alien abduction cases in modern history. The Travis Walton incident is unlike almost any other UFO case you've ever heard about, and I'm going to tell you why. This wasn't some guy claiming he saw lights in the sky, or someone who woke up with mysterious marks and vague memories of being taken aboard a spaceship. This was a case with 6 witnesses who all saw the same thing happen at the same time, a disappearance that was immediately reported to the police. A massive search and rescue operation involving dozens of people, and a victim who came back 5 days later with incredibly detailed memories of what happened to him during those missing days. And here's the kicker. Every single one of those witnesses passed multiple lie detector tests, even when they were tested separately and asked to provide specific details about what they had seen. Let me set the scene for you. It's November 5th, 1975. And Travis Walton is working as part of a 7-man logging crew in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest near Snowflake, Arizona. Travis was 22 years old at the time, a local guy who had grown up in the area and was known around town as a straight shooter who didn't drink much, didn't do drugs, and certainly wasn't the type to make up wild stories for attention. He was working for a local contractor named Mike Rogers, who had a contract with the Forest Service to thin out a section of forest in the Turkey Springs area. The crew that day consisted of Travis Walton, Mike Rogers, who was both the crew boss and Travis's best friend since childhood, Dwayne Smith, John Gillette, Ken Peterson, Alan Dallas, and Steve Pierce. These were all local guys, mostly young men in their 20s and 30s, who knew each other well and had been working together for months on this particular contract. They weren't city folks or outsiders. These were Arizona country boys who had grown up hunting, fishing, and spending time in the woods. They knew what belonged in the forest and what didn't. The workday on November 5th had been pretty routine. The crew was using chainsaws to thin out the forest, cutting down smaller trees and brush to reduce fire hazards and improve the health of the remaining larger trees. It was hard physical work that required them to be spread out over a fairly large area, but they were used to it and had developed a good rhythm over the months they'd been working the contract. As evening approached, they began cleaning up their work area and loading their tools back into Mike Rogers' pickup truck for the ride back to Snowflake. It was around 6:10 p.m. when they finished up and climbed into the truck for the 15-mile drive back to town. Mike Rogers was driving, the rest of the crew packed into the cab in the bed of the pickup. They were taking the same route they always took, a dirt logging road that wound through the forest before connecting to the main highway back to Snowflake. The sun was setting, and while it wasn't completely dark yet, the forest was getting pretty dim under the canopy of trees. They had been driving for maybe 10 or 15 minutes when Steve Pierce, who was sitting in the back of the truck, suddenly shouted for Mike to stop. He was pointing up ahead and to the right of the road where there was clearly something that didn't belong in the forest. Mike hit the brakes, and as the truck slowed down, all 7 men got their first clear look at what would change their lives forever. About 100 yards off the road, maybe 15 feet above a clearing in the trees, there was a large disc-shaped object that was glowing with a yellowish light. The thing was maybe 40 feet in diameter and about 8 feet thick, shaped like 2 dinner plates put together rim to rim. It wasn't making any sound that they could hear over the truck engine, but it was clearly not anything that belonged in the Arizona wilderness. The object appeared to be hovering motionlessly above the ground, with light emanating from its entire surface in a way that seemed almost alive. Now you have to understand that these guys weren't UFO enthusiasts or conspiracy theorists. They were working men who had probably never given much thought to flying saucers or little green men. But here they were, staring at something that was undeniably real and undeniably not from around here. For a moment, nobody said anything. They just sat there in the truck, trying to process what they were looking at. Travis Walton, who was sitting in the passenger seat next to Mike Rogers, was the first one to break the spell. According to the testimony of all 6 witnesses, Travis opened the door of the truck and started walking toward the object. Mike Rogers immediately started yelling for him to come back, and the other crew members were shouting similar warnings, but Travis seemed transfixed by what he was seeing. He kept walking toward the clearing where the object was hovering. As Travis got closer to the UFO, the witnesses reported that the object began to make a sound, a low humming or vibrating noise that seemed to increase in intensity as Travis approached. The light emanating from the craft also seemed to get brighter and more intense. Travis had made it to within about 20 feet of the object when suddenly, according to all 6 witnesses, a beam of light shot out from the bottom of the craft and struck Travis in the chest. The witnesses all described the beam as being bluish-white in color and very intense, almost like a bolt of lightning but sustained rather than instantaneous. The beam hit Travis and lifted him up off the ground, throwing him backward through the air for about 10 feet before he hit the ground and lay still. The witnesses said it looked like he had been hit by a bolt of electricity. His body went rigid, his arms flew out to his sides, and he was clearly unconscious before he even hit the ground. Mike Rogers, who had been watching this happen to his best friend, immediately threw the truck into reverse and backed up rapidly, putting more distance between the truck and the UFO. The other crew members were shouting and some of them were beginning to panic. They had just watched their coworker get knocked unconscious by some kind of energy beam from an unidentified flying object, and they had no idea what to do about it. As they watched from their position, about 200 yards back up the road, the UFO began to move. According to the witnesses, the craft rose silently and rapidly into the air, moving up through the trees and disappearing into the darkening sky. Within a matter of seconds, the forest suddenly became very quiet and very dark, with only the headlights of the truck providing any illumination in the clearing where Travis had been struck down. After a few minutes of heated discussion in the truck, with some crew members wanting to flee the area immediately and others insisting they had to go back and help Travis, Mike Rogers finally drove back to the clearing. They fully expected to find Travis lying unconscious where they had seen him fall, probably injured and in need of immediate medical attention. But when they reached the spot where he had been struck by the beam, Travis was gone. The crew spent the next several minutes searching the immediate area, calling Travis's name and using their flashlights to look through the surrounding trees and brush. There was no sign of him anywhere. The ground where he had fallen showed no obvious marks or disturbances, and there was no blood or any other indication that he had been injured and crawled away. Travis Walton had simply vanished. Now imagine being in Mike Rogers' position. At this point, his best friend since childhood has just been struck by some kind of energy beam from a UFO and has completely disappeared. He's got 5 other crew members who are witnesses to what happened, but he knows that nobody in town is going to believe this story. He also knows that he's going to have to explain to Travis's family and to the police what happened to their friend and coworker. The whole situation was completely surreal and terrifying. After searching for about 30 minutes and finding no trace of Travis, Mike Rogers made the decision to drive back to Snowflake and report what had happened. The crew was divided about whether this was the right thing to do. Some of them thought they should keep searching, while others worried that if they reported a UFO abduction, they would be arrested as suspects in Travis's disappearance. But Mike insisted that they had to tell the truth about what they had witnessed, no matter how crazy it sounded. They arrived in Snowflake around 7:30 p.m. and immediately went to the home of Travis's mother, Mary Kellett. Mike Rogers had the terrible job of telling her that her son had been struck by a beam of light from a UFO and had disappeared. As you might expect, Miss Kellett's first reaction was disbelief and anger. She thought the men were playing some kind of cruel joke on her. But as Mike and the other crew members continued to insist that they were telling the truth, and as she saw how obviously shaken and upset they all were, she began to realize that something terrible had really happened. Mrs. Kellett immediately called the Navajo County Sheriff's Office to report her son missing. Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Deputy Glenn Flake responded to the call and arrived at the Kellett home around 8 p.m. The officers interviewed Mike Rogers and the other crew members separately, getting their individual accounts of what had happened in the forest. From a law enforcement perspective, this was an extremely unusual situation. The officers were dealing with 6 witnesses, who all claimed to have seen the same impossible thing happen. The witnesses were clearly upset and appeared to be telling the truth, but their story involved a UFO abduction, which was not exactly the kind of case that rural Arizona sheriffs dealt with on a regular basis. The officers also had to consider the possibility that the witnesses were lying and that Travis Walton had actually been the victim of foul play. Sheriff Gillespie made the decision to treat this as a standard missing person case, while also investigating the possibility that Travis had been murdered by his coworkers. The sheriff and his deputies returned to the forest that night with Mike Rogers and the crew to search the area where Travis had allegedly disappeared. Using powerful flashlights and spending several hours combing through the woods, they found no trace of Travis Walton or any evidence that he had been harmed. Over the next several days, the search for Travis Walton became one of the largest missing person operations in Arizona history. The Navajo County Sheriff's Office was joined by volunteers from Snowflake and surrounding communities, as well as search and rescue teams from across the state. Helicopters, search dogs, and ground teams scoured hundreds of square miles of forest, looking for any sign of the missing logger. The story also attracted the attention of UFO researchers and the media. Word of the alleged abduction spread quickly, and within 48 hours of Travis's disappearance, reporters and investigators were arriving in Snowflake to interview the witnesses and cover the story. The small Arizona town suddenly found itself at the center of a media circus that would continue for months. During this time, the 6 crew members who had witnessed Travis's disappearance were subjected to intense scrutiny from law enforcement, the media, and UFO investigators. Sheriff Gillespie remained suspicious that the men had killed Travis and made up the UFO story to cover their crime. The witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, given polygraph tests, and had their backgrounds thoroughly investigated. The results of these investigations were remarkable. All 6 witnesses passed multiple lie detector tests, administered by different examiners. Their stories remained consistent through dozens of interviews, even when they were questioned separately and asked to provide detailed descriptions of what they had seen. Background checks revealed that all 6 men were considered honest and reliable by their friends and neighbors. There was no evidence of any motive for them to harm Travis, and no evidence that they had the means or opportunity to dispose of his body without leaving a trace. 3 days after Travis's disappearance, the crew members were given polygraph tests by Cy Gilson, one of Arizona's most experienced polygraph examiners. The test focused on 2 key questions. Did you tell the truth about actually seeing a UFO last Wednesday when Travis Walton disappeared? And do you know what happened to Travis Walton? All 6 men passed both questions, meaning that in the examiner's professional opinion, they were telling the truth about seeing a UFO, and they did not know what had happened to Travis after he was struck by the beam. The polygraph results created a serious problem for Sheriff Gillespie's murder theory. If the witnesses were telling the truth about seeing a UFO, and if they genuinely didn't know what had happened to Travis after he was struck by the beam, then they probably hadn't killed him. But if they hadn't killed him, where was he? The search teams had found no trace of him anywhere in the forest, and it seemed impossible that he could have survived being struck by the energy beam described by the witnesses. Meanwhile, Travis's family was dealing with their own nightmare. His mother, Mary Cullett, had to cope with the possibility that her son was dead, while also dealing with the media attention and the skepticism of people who didn't believe the UFO story. Travis's brother Dwayne became one of the most vocal advocates for the witnesses, insisting that he knew the men well and that they would never lie about something so serious. The UFO research community was also closely following the case. Organizations like the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, and the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NACAP, sent investigators to Snowflake to interview the witnesses and examine the evidence. These investigators brought a different perspective to the case than law enforcement, as they were more willing to consider the possibility that the UFO story was literally true. As the days passed without any trace of Travis, the story continued to attract national and international media attention. The case was featured on television news programs, in newspapers and magazines, and on radio shows across the country. Snowflake, Arizona, population 3,000, suddenly found itself famous for what was being called one of the most compelling UFO cases ever documented. Then, on November 10, 1975, exactly 5 days after his disappearance, Travis Walton reappeared as suddenly and mysteriously as he had vanished. At approximately 12:05 a.m., Travis's brother-in-law, Grant Neff, received a phone call at his home in Snowflake. The caller identified himself as Travis Walton and said he was at a phone booth at the Heber General Store, about 30 miles from where he had disappeared. Travis sounded confused and disoriented, and he told Grant that he needed help getting home. Grant Neff immediately called Travis's brother Dwayne and his brother-in-law Ken Peterson, and the three men drove to Heber to find Travis. When they arrived at the general store around 1:00 a.m., they found Travis standing beside the phone booth, apparently unharmed, but looking dazed and confused. He was wearing the same clothes he had been wearing when he disappeared 5 days earlier, but they were remarkably clean considering he had supposedly been missing in the wilderness for nearly a week. Travis's first words to his family were questions about how long he had been gone. He insisted that he had only been unconscious for a few hours, not 5 days. When his family told him how long he had been missing and described the massive search effort that had been conducted, Travis was shocked and confused. He said he remembered walking toward the UFO and being struck by the beam, but after that his memories were fragmented and unclear. The family brought Travis back to Snowflake, where he was examined by Dr. Howard Kendall, a local physician. Dr. Kendall found that Travis was in surprisingly good physical condition for someone who had supposedly been missing in the wilderness for 5 days. He was not dehydrated, malnourished, or suffering from exposure. In fact, he appeared to be in better health than would be expected for someone who had been lost in the forest without food or water for nearly a week. The one unusual finding was that Travis had lost about 10 pounds during his absence, which Dr. Kendall noted was more weight loss than would typically be expected from 5 days without food. Travis also had no facial hair growth, which was odd since he normally had a fairly heavy beard and would have been expected to show significant stubble after 5 days. These physical anomalies added to the mystery of where Travis had been and what had happened to him during his disappearance. When Travis had recovered sufficiently to give a detailed account of his experience, his story was even more extraordinary than anyone had expected. According to Travis, after being struck by the beam from the UFO, he regained consciousness aboard some kind of spacecraft. He found himself lying on a table in a dimly lit room that was unlike any earthly environment he had ever seen. Travis described waking up in what appeared to be a medical examination room. The air was warm and humid, and there was a strange, sweet smell that he couldn't identify. The room itself was small and cramped, with curved walls that seemed to be made of some kind of smooth metallic material. There were no visible seams or joints in the walls, as if the entire room had been molded from a single piece of material. When Travis tried to sit up, he discovered that he was having difficulty moving and felt weak and disoriented. As his vision cleared, he saw three small figures standing near the table where he was lying. These beings were about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with large heads that seemed disproportionate to their small bodies. Their skin was grayish-white and appeared smooth and hairless. Most striking were their eyes, which Travis described as enormous and dark, taking up a large portion of their faces. The beings were wearing what appeared to be simple brown robes or coveralls. They had small, almost vestigial noses and mouths, and their arms and hands seemed delicate and thin. Travis said they moved in a slow, deliberate manner and seemed to be examining him with some kind of instruments, though he couldn't clearly see what they were doing. When Travis tried to speak to the beings, they didn't respond to his voice. He attempted to sit up and move away from them, and at this point the beings retreated to the far side of the room. Travis said they seemed surprised or alarmed by his consciousness and mobility, as if they hadn't expected him to wake up during whatever procedure they were performing. Travis managed to get off the table and noticed that he was naked. He felt weak and unsteady on his feet, but he was able to move around the room. The beings continued to watch him from a distance, but they didn't try to restrain him or force him back onto the table. After a few minutes, the beings left the room through what Travis described as a seamless opening in the wall that appeared and disappeared without any visible door or mechanism. Left alone in the room, Travis began to explore his surroundings more thoroughly. He found what appeared to be a control panel or console along one wall with various buttons, switches, and displays that he didn't recognize. The technology seemed far advanced beyond anything he had ever seen, with no visible wires, screws, or other conventional mechanical components. Travis said he spent what felt like several hours in this room, though he had no way to accurately judge the passage of time. Eventually, a different being entered the room. This individual was much more human-like in appearance than the first three beings. He was taller, about 6 feet in height, with more normal proportions and features. His skin was pale but more human-like, and while his eyes were larger than normal human eyes, they weren't as dramatically oversized as those of the smaller beings. This human-like being was wearing what Travis described as a tight-fitting blue coverall, or uniform. He didn't speak to Travis, but he gestured for Travis to follow him out of the room. Travis, who was still naked and feeling vulnerable, reluctantly followed the being through a series of corridors and chambers within what was clearly a much larger spacecraft. The being led Travis to another room where there were 3 more human-like entities, 2 males and 1 female. These beings had the same general appearance as the first one Travis had encountered, with pale skin, large eyes, and an overall human-like but somehow artificial appearance. The female being approached Travis and gestured for him to lie down on another table in this room. Travis was hesitant to comply, but the beings seemed non-threatening and he was beginning to feel weak and dizzy again. He lay down on the table, and the female being placed what Travis described as a clear mask or breathing apparatus over his face. The mask seemed to be connected to some kind of life support system, and as Travis breathed through it, he began to feel drowsy and disoriented. This is the last thing Travis remembered clearly from his time aboard the spacecraft. He said his next conscious memory was of lying on his back on the ground in the forest, looking up at the night sky. He could see what appeared to be the bottom of a large disc-shaped craft, moving away from him and disappearing into the darkness above the trees. Travis was confused and disoriented, and it took him several minutes to realize where he was. He found himself on the edge of the same clearing where he had been struck by the beam 5 days earlier, but he had no memory of how he had gotten there or what had happened during the intervening time. He was wearing his own clothes again, and while he felt weak and confused, he didn't appear to be injured. Travis made his way through the forest to the highway, a distance of about 2 miles. He said the walk took him much longer than it normally would have, because he kept having to stop and rest. When he reached the highway, he walked about a mile to the Heber General Store, where he found a payphone and called his brother-in-law for help. The details of Travis's account of his time aboard the spacecraft were consistent and detailed, but they were also completely unverifiable. There was no physical evidence of his alleged abduction other than his own testimony, and the unexplained circumstances of his disappearance and reappearance. However, Travis's story was subjected to the same intense scrutiny that the original witnesses had faced. Travis was given multiple polygraph tests by different examiners to determine whether he was telling the truth about his alleged abduction experience. The results of these tests were mixed and became a source of controversy. An initial test administered by John J. McCarthy, a polygraph examiner hired by APRO, concluded that Travis was being deceptive when he answered questions about his abduction experience. However, this test was conducted just 2 days after Travis's return, when he was still recovering from his ordeal and may not have been in an optimal psychological state for testing. Subsequent polygraph tests conducted by other examiners reached different conclusions. A test administered by George Pfeiffer, a polygraph expert from California, concluded that Travis was telling the truth about his abduction experience. Another test conducted by Cy Gilson, the same examiner who had tested the original witnesses, also concluded that Travis was being truthful. The conflicting polygraph results added to the controversy surrounding the case and provided ammunition for both believers and skeptics. Supporters of Travis's story pointed to the positive results from the later tests and argued that the initial negative result was due to Travis's poor psychological state immediately after his return. Skeptics argued that the negative result from the first test was the most reliable because it was conducted before Travis had time to rehearse his story or be influenced by outside suggestions. In addition to the polygraph tests, Travis was subjected to extensive medical and psychological examinations. Dr. Harold Kahn, a psychiatrist brought in to evaluate Travis, concluded that he was not suffering from any obvious mental illness or psychological disorder that would cause him to fabricate his story. However, Dr. Kahn also noted that Travis seemed unusually calm and detached when describing his alleged abduction experience, which some observers found suspicious. Physical examinations of Travis continued to reveal the puzzling anomalies that had been noted immediately after his return. His weight loss of 10 pounds in 5 days was difficult to explain if he had simply been lost in the wilderness, as people lost in the woods typically lose only 1-2 pounds per day. The lack of facial hair growth was also unusual, as was his generally good physical condition despite supposedly being without food and water for 5 days. Blood and urine tests were conducted to check for drugs or other substances that might explain Travis's condition or his memories of the abduction. These tests came back negative for all known drugs, including hallucinogens, sedatives, and other substances that might cause the kind of experiences Travis described. The investigation into Travis's disappearance and alleged abduction attracted the attention of numerous UFO researchers, scientists, and skeptics. The case was examined by organizations ranging from the Center for UFO Studies, headed by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, to the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal CSICOP, a skeptical organization that sought to debunk UFO claims. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who is the leading academic UFO researcher of his time and had served as a consultant to the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book, considered the Travis Walton case to be one of the most significant UFO incidents ever documented. Hynek was particularly impressed by the multiple witnesses, the immediate reporting to authorities, and the thorough investigation that had been conducted. On the skeptical side, researchers like Philip J. Klass argued that the entire incident was an elaborate hoax perpetrated by Travis and the logging crew. Klass suggested that the men had conspired to fake the abduction in order to get out of their logging contract, which was running behind schedule and over budget. According to this theory, Travis had hidden in the woods for 5 days while his coworkers maintained the UFO story, and then he had reappeared with a fabricated account of his abduction experience. However, the hoax theory faced several significant problems. First, there was no evidence that the logging crew had any financial motive to abandon their contract. And in fact, Mike Rogers lost money when the contract was terminated due to Travis's disappearance. Second, The idea that Travis could have survived for 5 days in the Arizona wilderness in November without proper equipment, food, or water seemed implausible, especially given his good physical condition when he returned. Third, the consistency and detail of the witnesses' accounts, combined with their successful polygraph tests, made it difficult to believe that 6 men could maintain such an elaborate deception under intense scrutiny. The Travis Walton case also attracted the attention of Hollywood, and in 1993 the story was adapted into a major motion picture called Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney as Travis Walton and Robert Patrick as Mike Rogers. While the film took significant dramatic liberties with the actual events, it helped to bring the case to a much wider audience and cemented its place in popular culture as one of the most famous UFO incidents in history. The movie's depiction of Travis's alleged abduction experience was considerably more horrific and dramatic than his actual account. While Travis described a relatively calm and clinical examination by the alien beings, the film portrayed him as being subjected to terrifying and invasive medical procedures. These dramatic changes were made for entertainment value, but they also created some confusion about the actual details of Travis's claims. In the years following his return, Travis Walton became a prominent figure in the UFO community. He wrote a book about his experience called The Walton Experience, which was later republished as Fire in the Sky. To tie in with the movie, he appeared at UFO conferences, gave interviews to researchers and journalists, and became one of the most recognizable alleged abduction victims in the world. Travis's story remained remarkably consistent over the decades following his alleged abduction. In numerous interviews and presentations, he continued to provide the same basic account of his experience, with only minor variations in detail. This consistency was seen by supporters as evidence of the truthfulness of his claims, while skeptics argued that it simply showed his commitment to maintaining his story regardless of the truth. The original witnesses to Travis's disappearance also maintained their accounts over the years. Despite facing ridicule and skepticism from some quarters, all 6 men continued to insist that they had seen Travis struck by a beam of light from a UFO, and that he had disappeared before their eyes. Some of the witnesses, particularly Mike Rogers, paid a significant personal price for sticking to their story, as they were ostracized by some members of their community who didn't believe their account. In 2005, 30 years after the original incident, all of the surviving witnesses participated in a new documentary about the case. By this time, several of the original crew members had died, but those who remained continued to insist that their account of Travis's disappearance was accurate. They submitted to new polygraph tests and interviews, and their stories remained consistent with their original testimony from that. The Travis Walton case has been analyzed and reanalyzed by researchers, scientists, and investigators for nearly 5 decades since it occurred. It remains one of the most thoroughly documented and investigated UFO cases in history, with thousands of pages of documentation, dozens of interviews, multiple polygraph tests, medical examinations, scientific analyses. From an evidentiary standpoint, the case presents a compelling puzzle. The multiple witnesses, immediate reporting to authorities, extensive search efforts, and thorough investigation all lend credibility to the claim that something extraordinary happened to Travis Walton in November 1975. The physical anomalies observed after his return, the consistency of the witnesses' accounts, and the results of polygraph testing provide additional support for the idea that the witnesses were telling the truth about what they experienced. However, the case also raises fundamental questions about the nature of evidence and the limits of human knowledge. Travis's account of his time aboard an alien spacecraft, while detailed and consistent, remains unverifiable and challenges our understanding of physics, biology, and the likelihood of extraterrestrial visitation. The mixed results of polygraph testing remind us that even our best investigative tools have limitations and can produce conflicting results. The Travis Walton case continues to be studied and debated by researchers from various fields. Psychologists have examined it as a case study in memory, trauma, and group dynamics. Sociologists have looked at how the case was received by the local community and the broader public. Folklorists have analyzed it as a modern legend that reflects contemporary anxieties about technology and the unknown. Whatever one's personal beliefs about the reality of UFOs and alien abduction, the Travis Walton case remains a fascinating example of how extraordinary claims are investigated and evaluated in our society. It demonstrates both the power and the limitations of eyewitness testimony, scientific investigation, and public discourse in determining truth and understanding reality. The case also illustrates the personal cost that can be associated with reporting extraordinary experiences. Travis Walton and the 6 witnesses to his disappearance all paid a price for coming forward with their story, facing skepticism, ridicule, and in some cases, ostracism from their community. Their willingness to maintain their account, despite these consequences, suggests either a remarkable commitment to truth or an equally remarkable dedication to maintaining a fabrication. As we continue to search for answers to fundamental questions about our place in the universe and the possibility of extraterrestrial life, cases like the Travis Walton incident provide important data points for consideration. Whether one views the case as evidence of alien visitation, an elaborate hoax, or something else entirely, it represents a significant event in the history of UFO research and continues to challenge our understanding of what is possible in this vast and mysterious cosmos. The Travis Walton case stands as a testament to the power of human testimony and the importance of thorough investigation. It reminds us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but also that we should remain open to possibilities that challenge our current understanding of reality. Whether Travis Walton was actually abducted by extraterrestrial beings, or whether some other explanation accounts for the events of November 1975, his case continues to inspire wonder, debate, and investigation nearly 5 decades after it occurred. If you're fascinated by mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena like the Travis Walton case, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the world's most compelling mystery. We've got plenty more incredible stories of missing time, alien encounters, and unexplained events that will challenge everything you think you know about our reality. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and your mind open to the impossible. Te hoa jeo san.